Hello, everyone. Today I am with Dennis Patrick Slattery. He is Emeritus Professor at Pacifica Graduate Institute and the author of over 20 books, I think, Dennis?
33.
33. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I wondered about that because the last book I read, it had 24, but then I thought, oh, I think you've written quite a few after that. So now I understand 33. And books on poetry within that. And at the moment, I'm reading The Way of Myth. I also have your book on the Odyssey.
Wonderful.
And I like also on the one on finding the personal myth. So lots of great material in there.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Yeah, so should I start or?
No, welcome. And yes, how we normally start, Dennis, if it's okay by you, is to just to tell a little bit about perhaps, parents and where you were born, and then to go onto your story and how you wandered out of the village and into Jung and myth and all of those kinds of things. And just before we start, Dennis,
Yeah.
Dennis Patrick Slattery. I'm just taking a stab at it, but do you have Irish heritage in there?
Yeah, as Irish as Paddy's pig, John. The Slatterys were from County Mayo, and I believe also County Cork. So those were the two designated areas that I tracked them. And years ago when Sandy and I visited County Mayo, and I told them my name, and they said, "Oh, the Slatterys, you've got to go. You've got to visit. There's two on the next street." And sometimes we did. Sometimes we knocked on the door and no one was there. But I knew I was in the right neighborhood.
There were Slatterys everywhere, were there?
There were Slatterys everywhere.
Anyway, Dennis, where were you born in the US, and something about your parents before we start?
Sure. My mother is more as much English as she is Irish because her father came from England and her mother came from Belfast. And her mother left Ireland, especially Belfast, because of her Catholicism. And she was ostracized. And where she worked, no one would speak to her, and it was just pretty terrible. So they came over and they met in Connecticut. And my both of his parents were from Ireland. So they met in Cleveland. And I was the second of 7 children that my mother had. One sister lived for a month and died, and the other my mother lost in childbirth. So I have 3 brothers and a sister, and I'm second in line. I was born in 1944. We lived on St. Clair Avenue in a dingy apartment upstairs. Downstairs was a restaurant and a dry cleaner and shoe shop and a couple of other things. So there was always the aroma of food and leather and so forth coming into the house. It was 1-bedroom apartment. And I can't remember the word, but my parents would pull down a trundle bed out of the wall and the living room would become their bedroom. And I noticed even at a young age that there were an inordinate number of beer bottles always around. And the beer bottle became a formative psychological image for my destiny in leading me into study psychology and sociology. So my father was an alcoholic at a young age. So were his 2 brothers. And then their 2 sisters were angels. Their one sister was a Ursuline nun, one of the sweetest women I ever met, taught Latin 1 through 4 in high school. Right. And my Aunt Mary and Uncle Ed had 11 children. And my Aunt Mary supported Mother Teresa for decades. And I never forget going over there and visiting one time. And there was a photo of my Aunt Mary standing next to Mother Teresa, who
Right.
had wanted to meet her. So a very Catholic family, replete with the alcoholic gene that was vital and well. Then when I was 5, my father bought a home in Euclid, Ohio, which was next door, and in a suburb. And so we grew up there in a 3-bedroom house. My older brother, me, and then my younger brother, Bob, and then years later, my brother, Bill, and then my sister, Mary Beth, who my mother said saved her life. She had all this male testosterone in the house, and my sister gave a feminine atmosphere. And I don't think my mother was speaking in hyperbole when she said that.
And have
So
you were
yes.
you always a big reader, Dennis, from a young age? Have you because you know, reading through your books, you're a voracious reader, really, aren't you? And I wondered whether you started young in
No,
all of that.
we are really in sync here, John, because that's where I was heading next. I didn't like schools, and I didn't like the Ursuline nuns a lot. I had some good ones, and I had some real mean women with wimples and veils.
Yeah.
But I watched my mother, who read to escape, I think, into her own space. And I was fascinated by it. And I used to fake being sick. I had a little strategy of pouring water into the toilet and making heaving sounds. I think my mother was onto me, but I'd say, look, I really want to stay home. So my mother would go up to the city library, get herself several books, and get me 6 or 7 books. And I would spend 2 days under a canopy, my blankets, with a flashlight and a little plastic radio, listening to Nat King Cole and the McGuire sisters and that whole group. And I would read, and I would read, and I loved it. And of course, a lot of it was an escape.
Yeah.
But John, as I mentioned to you before, in gratitude for you having me put my life here into 10 pages, it occurred to me that covering that I would hide in. And after 2 days, my mother would say, you know, go ahead and let's try it, go back to school. And I was fine with it. And it was all sotto voce, and we both knew what was going on.
Yeah.
I think that was my monastic cell, because the monastic tradition of the Catholic Church just pulled me into it when I was a senior. So I read because of imitating my mother and thinking there's something good here. She wouldn't waste her time with it. And I did become a voracious reader, and I loved learning to read, and then I loved learning to write cursively.
Yeah.
And so when I was 10, just to extend this, these are the pop-up pieces.
Yeah.
My father came home. Now, he spent a lot of the money on booze, but he also was a little sharper than all of us knew. So he came home one day with a scripto pen and 4 cartridges, and I bet your listeners and your audience remembers them. And
they used to go all over the place in my world. Unfortunately, they'd start running through.
Oh,
through things. But anyway, continue on.
My father must have seen something in me that I didn't see in myself. So he gave this gift to me, and I thought, Dad, this is great. So I sat on the arm of a chair in the living room, and I'd say, well, what am I going to write? Well, what do I know? Well, I know prayers. So I wrote out the Our Father, and I wrote out the Hail Mary, And then I wrote out the Glory Be, and I'm just loving the drag of the fountain pen on the paper.
Yeah.
And I said, now what? So I began to create a story, an adventure story, with my older brother, my younger brother, and me. And it was my introduction into creative writing at the age of 10. And so my father had an intuitive sense about him. And he was, when he was sober, he was the sweetest man in the world. It was the weekends that turned into an infernal region for all of us. So that was a big moment. Then I went on to high school in Cleveland, which was just over the border from Euclid. And it was a Marianist high school, all male. And the women's school was about 2 miles away. And when we had dances, they were just fabulous because the school just mixed the two of us up. And you know, I really enjoyed an all-male high school experience for 4 years. But here's the thing that, and I did well and was elected homeroom president. Then senior year, I ran for office of the student council treasurer and got it, and then served with 3 of my buddies. And that was a big deal. It was good for my esteem because my esteem was very low. My shame, which we inherited from my father, and always angry. So we all went to graduate school with my father, and we majored in rage and shame. And those were our 2 fundamental emotions. Senior year, all of us were required to show up Friday evening, I think it was in May, school year ended in June, to the diocesan retreat house next door to the high school. And the high school sat right on Lake Erie. It was just really a beautiful place. And if you wanted to practice golf, you watched which way you were aiming because Lake Erie would swallow them up as quickly as you hit them out there. So it was a retreat from Friday afternoon till Sunday at noon or 1. And it was almost like an exit occasion for seniors. And all the guys were given rooms with 2 or 3 in them. But they gave me my own room. I didn't know why, but I'd never had my own room. And so I immediately felt so at home, not only in having my own space, but the quiet, the solitude, because the Marianist brothers were sincere about our making a true retreat. And I also noticed that they put me between 2 of the Marianist brothers. All right, so the second day, maybe Saturday afternoon, one of them called me into his room. And he said, have you ever thought about becoming a Marianist brother? And I said, to be honest, no. And he said, oh, well, let me just talk to you a little bit because we'd like you to consider going down to the University of Dayton, which was a Marianist university, and St. Joe's and other schools were feeders to it. But it was also a place where vocations might ignite and one goes on to the priesthood or becomes a Marianist brother. And I had no sense of myself, who I was, what I was, where I was going. And so it was like they were talking to somebody other than me in my body. And I said, I'm happy to give it thought. And they said, well, that's all we're asking. And I subsequently started at the first community college in the state of Ohio in 1963. So I bypassed their offer. And for me, it was something intuitive in me, knew.
Well, it wasn't quite the way. Although there might be a bit of a monk within still.
Well, see, you're onto it, John, because subsequent to that, and I'll speak about it in just a couple of minutes. I began because of a brother, a priest, at a Lorraine Catholic high school, where I subsequently started to teach in 1970. And I used to go in and serve Mass. And I love serving Mass as a elementary student. And I did it for 3 years and learned the Latin Mass verbatim. And that was my first experience with a foreign language, which I loved.
Mm.
And often I didn't know what I was saying in Latin, but I had it memorized. And I loved the ritual of speaking in another language. So Father Bill said, I said, where is there a place that I could retreat to? And he said, there's only one place for you to go, and that's Gethsemane Monastery in Trappist, Kentucky, which was about 450 miles south over the Kentucky border. And so I wound up, and I know I've jumped ahead, and I'm going to come back a little bit, but I want to play this thread out. And I haven't said anything about Kent State yet, which I want to do. But I'd started buying motorcycles in 1968, and I've had motorcycles and ridden them up until about 6 months ago, where I sold the Harley Davidson and the Honda Goldwing because I was getting unsteady out on the road. So I rode for 55 years. I rode, and I loved it. There's something about the motorcycle. Talk about an archetype. Talk about, in Joseph Campbell's language, talk about a transport vehicle that promises to take you alone from here to here. So I rode my BMW down to Gethsemane in June of 71.
So just one thing there, Patrick. So you're like a biker monk.
Biker monk, motorcycle monk. That's it. That's it. And it's John, I really think the archetype that has gripped me my entire life is one of a journeyer, a voyager. And I loved going out on the road. I met and married a woman now 55 years who has supported me and cut me loose anytime I wanted to hang out. I think that's in large measure why we're still married, because of the freedom she gave me, and I try to reciprocate. When I got down there and the monks checked me in, and this is where I learned how popular and attractive Jung's thinking was at this monastery. They told me, we love the mystical quality of Jung's writing. And so he was an integral part. And at this moment, I didn't follow up on it, but that was the first
seed
mention of Jung actually collapsing analytical psychology and Christian monasticism. So I went down to the basement, and I'm looking in these glass cases, and there's all these letters from Jacques Maritain to Thomas Merton, Flannery O'Connor to Thomas Merton, people from all different disciplines. And I'm wondering, who is this Merton? And one of the brothers comes up behind me and greets me, and I said, I've just checked in. And I said, who is this Merton guy? And he said, well, I think I can help you there. So he walked me over to the bookshelves, which were with multiple copies of all of Merton's work. And then he said, would you like to meet him? And I said, well, yeah, I would. I didn't know his dates. I didn't know if he was alive or dead, but he said, would you like to meet him? Absolutely. So we walked out of the chapel, around a little grass area, fenced, and in. And he said, there he is, third one over. And I see this cross that says Father Lewis. And I said, it says Father Lewis. He said, well, that was the name that he had here, but his name is Thomas Merton. And I was talking to Brother Patrick Hart, who for 24 years was Merton's a private secretary.
Right.
And it had a lot to do with editing and pushing Merton's works out into the world. So he and I became friends, and over a 20-year period, John, I made 12 pilgrimages to Gethsemane because, and I really think the only reason I'm a practicing Roman Catholic today is because of the Western monastic wing of the Catholic Church.
Which is
Yeah.
like a mystical, is it a mysticism, is it? There's a mysticism in there?
It's mystical. It is both psychological and spiritual.
Right.
It's and no wonder Jung was so attractive because of that polytheistic, multidisciplined way of looking at the world
Yeah.
that Hillman then picks up with
Like,
archetypal psychology. So that was a huge turning point. But there was something else. When Sandy and I married, we rented a apartment inside a large house in Kent, Ohio.
yeah.
And I was working on a master's in comparative lit.
Yeah.
Sandy had just landed a job with the Ravenna School District to teach 7th and 8th graders history and math. Now, Joseph Campbell says one of the things put him on the map is pay attention to what calls you. You actually get a calling either from the inside out or something outside in.
Yeah.
And I'd love to tell all of you listening this story, because about 7 days before the start of the 1968 school year, I get a call. Sandy's already out preparing to start teaching in a week. And I get a call from the assistant superintendent of the Ravenna School District. And he says, "Are you the Dennis Slattery that is married to Sandra Slattery, who we just hired?" And I said, "I am." He said, "We just learned that our special education teacher, who is to begin next week, has just quit. Would you be interested in the job?"
Right.
Now, John, I didn't know what the term special education meant. And I said yes. 2 days later, I drove out to the school, which was about 10 miles east of the city of Kent.
Yeah.
Out in the corn country, rural, and went into the school, Palmyra Elementary, and met the principal. He took me down to the basement. There was a janitor with all the coal. It was a coal burning furnace. He walked me into the deserted band room because they had budget said, no more music, no more band, that's gone. It was painted blue, ceiling, walls, not the floor, it was concrete. On the shelf were 7 textbooks. 2 of them matched. He said, "This is your room. And here are the textbooks." And he said, "I have only 2 directives for you. Keep your students quiet." And of course, we're down in the bowels of the school. "And keep them away from the normal students." And with that, he closed the door. Now, the students weren't there yet. It was about 5 days before. And I stood in that classroom and looked around and said, "What in the hell have I gotten myself into?" I wouldn't know a lesson plan from an armadillo. But thankfully, 2 of the women who taught there took me under their wing, helped me transcribe or to make up lesson plans.
Yeah.
And so I wound up with 11 students who I grouped into 3 groups, 1st and 2nd grade, 3rd grade, and then 4th grade. Now, these were throwaway kids. These were kids with neurological problems. These were discipline problems where psychological testing manipulated them into the dumping ground
Yeah.
AKA special education.
Yeah.
I taught those kids for 2 years, and I think they taught me all the real lessons I needed as a teacher, which I subsequently did for 55 years.
Yeah.
Then here's another pivot. I call them pivotal people. Um, uh, yeah, pivotal people.
Yeah.
So a friend teaching in Lorain, Ohio, at a Catholic school, high school, called me and said, you know, we've got an opening. If you'd like, I think I can get you an interview. So my buddy Mike did. We drove up there, Sandy and I interviewed, they hired me, and then they found a position for Sandy teaching 7th grade at a Catholic middle school. So I started there in 19 in August of 1970. But what I don't want to leave out is that when I was teaching those young, beautiful kids for 2 years, the principal gave me the green light, spring quarter, to leave the school at 1 p.m. each Monday for the quarter to take my second to last course for the MA in comparative lit. And then I had a thesis to write, but that's later.
Right.
So
You were continuing on the studies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So here it is, May 4th, 1970, Monday afternoon. And I drive, park close to Satterfield Hall, get out of I was driving a Volkswagen van. I get out and I walk into Satterfield Hall. Now, this time of day, there's 300-400 students changing classes, first floor, second floor. I think it was 2 floors. Busy. It was empty. And I felt, wait a minute, it is Monday, it's not Sunday. What's going on here? And I'm thinking, I have no hook on reality. Then down from the other end of the hall comes a English professor in the door, and he's running. And I turned to him, and I saw that he was going to run by me. And so as he approached me, I grabbed him and I threw him up against the wall. And I said, where the hell is everybody? And his eyes were rolling in his head. And he said, they're murdering our students. And I just fell back. And then he raced on.
Sorry, Dennis, I'm butting in, but is that the Kent Street massacre that we hear about in Crosby, Stills, Nash, Young? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And I came onto campus. I can tell all of you, the M1 rifles began firing at 12:18 p.m. and they fired nonstop for 13 minutes.
Yeah.
So it ended around 12:30. I came on campus at 20 till 2.
Right.
So I leave that hallway and I climb up the hill, and then there's a rim around an area that is sunken. They call it Blanket Hill. That's where you go to make out. You want to lie in the sun, and there's a Liberty Bell there that is rung when one of Kent's athletic teams wins a game, and the bell is rung. It's a nice ritual.
Yeah.
Now I hear nobody. So as I climb up, people start becoming visible to me. And the first that I see are groups of National Guardsmen, I think 4 in a group, facing out, bayonets on their rifles. And I looked in the faces of these kids. They were kids. And it was between horror and hatred. And there were about 7 or 8 scattered. But there were also 3,500 people around the lip in complete silence because they were traumatized by the killings and the woundings that had already occurred.
Yeah.
And the bodies had been taken and the wounded had been taken. And so while I'm trying to get a handle, I don't dare ask anybody. The atmosphere was it was from another level of reality.
Yeah.
And at that moment, a convertible drives through the commons area with bullhorns saying, by the order of James Rhodes, this university is officially closed. Now there's 21,000 students attending. Students must evacuate the campus within 4 hours. Empty it out. Well, then it was pandemonium. No. Just before that, the guards down below and the police lined up 2 by 2 and began not to run, but to charge the hill a second time. And with that, people began to scatter, feeling they're going to open fire on us again. Then the car comes through and shuts the university down. Now, Sandy and I, oh, please.
Oh, Dennis, I was just thinking as you were talking, it reminds me, when Hillman writes about Senex and Pur, and I'm sorry, this is maybe a little bit theoretical for something that's so grave, but it's a huge thing when a state turns on its children, isn't it? Or it's young people. It's a very, very dark side of the Senex, if you want to put it that way.
Yes, it is. No,
Yeah.
that's a perfectly that's a beautiful illustration of it. Yeah, horrific and beautiful. Because Sandy and I had driver's licenses with the Kent address because of a house we were renting, we were fine. But if you left Kent and didn't have a valid driver's license, you were not allowed back in. So for 2 weeks, we lived in a police state. Small tanks running the streets. I mean, the overreaction was uncanny.
Enormous.
So a professor for the course said, he contacted us and said, if you want to start meeting at my house, we can finish out the quarter. So we did. There were about 11 of us, and we finished. Then we moved to Lorraine, and I taught there for 2 years, and Sandy taught for 2 years. The beginning of the second year, and I was 27, I realized I can't keep this pace up. I was teaching 5 classes a day with 3 preparations, and I had gotten permission. This is where psyche comes in. I had gotten permission from this very progressive sister whose order ran the school, I think Immaculate Heart of Mary, IHMs. I said, what is the chance of my starting a psychology department? She said, I love it, do it. Just like that. And she was wonderful to work with for 2 years and had a lot to do with where I'm heading next.
So you felt just I'm just backtracking 1 second. You fell into teaching kind of in a very synchronistic kind of way. And then the whole psychology department started in about 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
And I said to her, let's keep it to juniors and seniors. And that way, any student, freshman, sophomore, they'll come up into it. And I said, let's start with 1 section. 3 filled up overnight. The students were starving, not for and I'm going to be a little unkind here, not for the religious moralisms of the religious teaching the religion classes.
Yeah.
They knew they needed some other venue to speak about what they were really living in. And they saw psychology class. And so I began teaching some Jung, Adler, some Freud, some Skinner. I tried to give them like an overview of different modes of coming at the human person.
Yeah.
And then I taught literature in the other two classes. So then the second year, yeah, we put that into place. Then the second year, I contacted her and said, I would like to take 5 of the best seniors and create a seminar, maybe twice a week we meet, and we're going to choose the books. She said, do it. So I gathered these students into my Volkswagen van, and we drove down to Oberlin, Ohio, where Sandy and I were now living in an apartment. And that's funny. Let me finish this out, but I left out a very important piece back at Kent. So we went down, and I had found a casebook edited by Rollo May on existential psychology and psychiatry.
Yeah.
And I started reading these phenomenologists, Binswanger, Buitendijk, the Dutch school, an essay of Merleau-Ponty. And I thought, what would it be like to teach this? So this became the main text.
Right.
If all of you will be patient with my feeble mnemonics here for a second, I want to back up to Kent. Prior to the shootings, yes, when Sandy and I married, we moved into a large house and had an apartment. There's another fellow, Dave Jones, who was working on his PhD in the English department. We hooked up and just started to get to know each other. He had a wife and 2 children, and it was just Sandy and me. And he said, do you ever hear of this C.G. Jung? I said, no. He said, I think you need to, because we realized we were simpatico in spirit.
Yeah.
So he gave me Modern Man in Search of a Soul. That was my threshold crossing into reading Jung.
Right.
There was an old famous bookstore downtown Cleveland called Publix, Publix.
Mm.
He had tens of thousands of volumes of used books.
Mm.
So Dave and I started making pilgrimages periodically. From Kent to Cleveland was 45 miles, not a big shake. And we learned, we'd go down in the basement of this place with the naked light bulbs about every 20 feet.
Yeah.
Books like they were pushed back by shovels.
Mm.
And we started to find hardback copies of Jung's collected works,
Right.
1 volume at a time.
Yeah.
And I still have some of those, and there's a $3.75 price tag on it.
Gee, you were ripped off. That was just too expensive, Dennis.
Well, we had no money, so it could have been $33.50. But so we started to buy, and we realized we were both passionate about the way he thought about things.
Yeah.
I couldn't go beyond that, but it was more than sufficient.
Yeah.
And I had at one point been majoring in experimental psychology at Kent, and it was deadly dull.
Yeah.
So here comes Jung, another form of psychology.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is literature. This isn't just psychology. This is literary, and it's literature. So that partner, Dave, and I talked for the next 2 years. Yeah.
And you were exploring Jung in that conversation as well.
Yes, we would choose a path. We would choose a chapter in a book, or I'd say, look, this is the one I got at Publix. Here's what excites me, archetypes in the collective unconscious. And then I'd present that, and he would come back. So we did a little tutorial around Jung.
Yeah.
So then to Rollo May.
Yeah.
And this class now in 1971, we chose 3 texts for the semester, which was going to be plenty, I realized this too, not just Jung, but this phenomenology has something really mysterious and interesting. So I wrote Rollo May, and he was in New Hampshire writing either Love and Will or Power and Innocence,
Right.
both classics now.
Mm.
And I said, I'm teaching this group and I'm using this book. Where would you suggest? Is there any place that offers graduate programs in this? And he wrote back in 10 days, handwritten. And he said, yes, there's 3. He said Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, and that's still the mothership for phenomenology.
Yeah.
Adelphi University out on Long Island, and University of Florida at Gainesville. So Sandy and I had bought a new Super Beetle convertible, and for either Christmas break or spring break, we drove to Florida, and I interviewed, and it was sociology. Okay. Spring, we visited Adelphi University, and the fit was just not there. So I applied at Duquesne. 400 of us applied for 13 slots. Now, here's another Campbellian truism. When a door shuts, don't pout, look around, because there may be another one that is cracked open just enough to get your foot in there. So Father Murray, who was in charge of the Institute of Man at Duquesne, wrote me, they put me on standby. All the applicants that were accepted said yes. But then he scribbled a note, and he said, you know, there's a small Catholic university in Irving, Texas, and some of our graduates are involved in putting together a PhD in phenomenology. Why don't you look into that? And that is where I belonged.
Right.
So I applied, and I applied. Louise Cowan, who is another one of these pivotal people, wife of the president of the school, Don Cowan, said, I'd love to see you. So Sandy and I drove down to Texas in July of '72. We had never experienced heat. And we thought, what does God have against these people? I mean, it was it was 106. And we barked when it went to 90 in Ohio.
That's very cool for where I live in Western Australia, Dennis.
Truly.
It was only 106.
Oh my.
Well, it's about.
Oh my gosh, John.
But
well, I interviewed in a very air-conditioned place, and Louise accepted me. So August of 1972, the Institute of Philosophic Studies began with 18 of us. Right. Philosophy, political philosophy, theology, literature, phenomenology.
Wow.
And they asked us to major in a discipline and minor in a discipline through the PhD. Unheard of. And so I took phenomenology as the major and literature as the minor. When we started, and I took Louise's Russian novel class, I realized my soul is in literature. So I flip-flopped and minored in phenomenology, and continued to read Jung on the side when I could, but the course load was heavy, and I also worked part-time. So it just, because it was a full scholarship. And then you figure out how to buy soup and eat. And we had met in February of '73, our first son.
But in retrospect, Dennis, that the thing of, it seems to me that literature side has held you in good stead.
Exactly right.
Mm,
And that's part of why Hillman's work in developing this poetic basis of mind that's like a
yeah,
mantra for him, as you well know, and others listening and watching know as well.
yeah,
So went through the program. 74, it might be 75. Jim Hillman comes to the University of Dallas with Pat Berry,
yeah,
straight from Zurich.
yeah,
And Louise and Don love him. Louise Cowan, Don Cowan, they love
yeah,
him.
yeah,
Faculty love him.
yeah,
They make him academic dean. I think he flew back and forth for a little bit, feeling the place out because
yeah,
they were wanting to move back to the United States, and that's where they landed. I mean,
yeah,
this is a synchronicity that's made in heaven.
yeah,
I never forget the first time he and I talked, and I was a insecure and anxious graduate student.
yeah.
And one time at a little informal gathering, he turned to me and he said, "What are you interested in?" And I thought, is he talking to me? And he was. He said, "Yeah, what do you like to study?" And I'm telling you, my esteem level went up about 14 degrees.
Mm,
Like, who is this guy that is so famous? Now, Revisioning was published in 1975, I believe. So it was just coming out.
yeah,
So suddenly, phenomenology is starting to take a back seat to archetypal psychology because Jim's thinking, his presence,
yeah,
is so powerful. And
mm,
there wasn't a lot of resistance because everybody was, what is this archetypal psychology stuff? And some people had been reading Jung, but not many.
mm,
So he branded the place anew,
mm,
pretty much single-handedly. We had so little money that I couldn't afford to buy Revisioning, but
mm,
I was working as a Pinkerton rent-a-cop on the weekends at
mm.
a steel factory, which on the weekends was empty. And I was a guard. It was a non-weapon post. I told Pinkerton, no place where I'm carrying a gun, please.
Mm.
But it gave me solitude and quiet from Sunday noon till Monday at 8 a.m., Monday at 4 p.m., Tuesday 8 a.m. I was exhausted, but I was making money and I was reading,
Absorbing all the stuff.
absorbing it all. So I checked Revisioning out of the school library, took it to the place, found where they hid the Xerox key, and Xeroxed the whole mother load in one night.
After
When I
this
went,
podcast is finished, I might give them a call. Dan.
yeah, I don't think there's any statute of limitation on Xerox pilfering. The next time I went to work, there was a memo out to everybody from the president saying, when I find the person who did that Xeroxing bulk, your job is finished here. And I thought, I'm safe. A Pinkerton cop Xeroxing? Are you kidding? And I always wanted to tell Jim that story because I was Hermes thieving my copy of Revisioning, and I never had a chance to, or it didn't come up. Yeah.
I
So
heard a story not so long ago about Bob Dylan that when he, when he was very young, he went to some people's place and they had lots and lots of folk records, and he just took the records, and he just took them, and he said they interviewed him a long time later, and he said, I really needed to listen to those records.
it's a necessity. That's how I felt.
But
So
anyway,
no, that's great, and I'm glad that you're intermixing here
yeah,
with my story too, John. Um, there was when I got into my third year, I said to Louise Cowan, I really want to write my dissertation on Dostoevsky. Now, for the PhD, for all of us, there was a language requirement of 2 foreign languages. Now, I had been pretty proficient in Spanish for many years. So Spanish became one, and I translated a couple of articles from Spanish-speaking writers and learned how much the Spanish world is attached to the Russian world. They love the Russian works and the Russian imagination.
Right.
So that was easy. The second, when I told her that, she said, great, learn Russian. Now, Louise is one of those people that if you, not submit, I don't like the way that feels. If you yield to her, she will give her soul to you. If you resist, she drops you. It gets real simple.
Mm.
Learning Russian well enough to translate an article was harder than writing the dissertation, but I wanted it.
Mm.
And everyone knows when Eros is driving your engines, you'll learn Swahili if that's what it's going to take. So I did, and I wrote a dissertation on The Idiot, which was Dostoevsky's second big novel after Crime and Punishment. And that turned out to be my first published book in 1982, I think.
Right.
Louise also said to me, because the university had a sophomore semester in Rome program, not mandatory, but about 95% of the sophomores take advantage of it. So maybe 100 will come in the fall semester, 100 in the spring semester. Louise said to me, now Matt at this point is 3 years old. She said, if you can finish this dissertation and defend it by May 1 of 76, I'll send you, Sandy, and Matt to Italy to teach. Well, we couldn't believe it. And everything, my world became so narrowed in finishing, and I did. And in July of 76, with 3 J.C. Penney trunks filled, I think there were $14 each, and we lived out of those for 2 years. And off to Rome we went.
And you taught in Rome. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so I taught the American students from University of Dallas one class. I taught the literature class.
Right.
And there were faculty that came in to teach theology and philosophy. And I did that for the first semester. Then the current director and his wife, who just had a baby, said, yep, I think he can handle it, and Sandy can handle it. They left. So then I directed the program for 3 semesters, finishing in May of 1978. Well, that was maybe the most transformative experience of our lives, living there, and then teaching, and then being responsible for 100 sophomores a semester. And we did it. And there were times when I had to send students home because of their drinking and damage. And I said, no, the university they can fire me tomorrow, but these kids are going home. They've violated the rule of hospitality. I had to send faculty home that were acting up. And I thought, I'm going to do it my way. And if they want to pull us tomorrow, I said to Sandy, they let them do it. And they didn't. So those 2 years were marvelous.
And Dennis,
Then,
were you still
yes.
reading Hillman and all of that at this time?
I was
Jung?
reading Jung. In fact, I found on my shelf not long ago a hardback that I bought at a bookstore. If you're facing the Spanish Steps, there's a street running across, but it heads to Piazza del Popolo. And about 200 yards down was a used bookstore.
Right.
And that's where I bought a used but clean English copy of Psychology and Alchemy for 9,500 lira.
Right.
I mean, it was a treasure. So I would read it, at night, have a break, but I took it everywhere I went. It was Jung, portable Jung, in a fairly large volume. So we came back, and I taught 1 year for the University of Dallas, and then Texas Christian University for half a year, Southern Methodist University for 7. And then here's another pivotal person. And I share this with, this conviction with Tom Moore.
Yeah.
We were both denied tenure at Southern Methodist University. Tom in religious studies, I was in the rhetoric division of the English department. So I started to apply for jobs. I had no notions. But I heard about this Catholic University in San Antonio, which is just one of the loveliest cities in the United States. And the Riverwalk, all of that's about 25 feet below the surface of the streets. It's a magic mecca of restaurants. And so I thought, look, just apply. And so I filled out an application for the English position. So here's another synchronicity. There's a beautiful man at Southern Methodist. I'm blocking on his name. Marsh Terry, a wonderful short story writer, fiction writer. And he and I became friends. He was like my uncle that I never had. And he said, what's plans now that you've gotten the rejection for tenure? Which incidentally was one of the highest compliments the department could have paid me, because I was so unlike them. I wasn't going to fit. But at the time, it was a deep wound.
Yeah.
And as Hillman tells us again and again, the wounds are where the psyche is really alive and vital. It takes that, what does he have, that section in revisioning, which he calls pathologizing as mythologizing.
Yeah.
That's where the myth really gets shaped, when you get wounded, afflicted, ill, loss of a spouse, loss of a friend.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm applying to this university in San Antonio. And he said, yeah, which one? Because there are a few. And I told him the name, and he looks down and he starts smiling. And I said, why? Do you know anything? He said, I'm on their board. I'm on their board. Let me make a phone call. And so he makes a phone call to the dean at that time. And she knew of his work. She'd never met him. And he plugged me. And I went down and I interviewed. And this time there were 400 applicants, and I got the job.
Wow.
So we stayed there.
And what were you teaching? What were you teaching there?
Yeah, so I taught writing, literature, and then I would design courses where I would pull in 3 other faculty. Right. For example, one of the classes we called Altering the Image, ALTARING. What images do we put up on our altars and then we worship? So I was trying to pull in Hillman and Jung in my own way. Yeah. And teaching with 3 other, because 4 of us would do it. And I love this interdisciplinary way of thinking and approaching topics. And the students loved it because they watched us listen to each other when our lecture date came up. And then we would ask, and then we would turn and say, well, now, it's not our class, it's your class. But we were serving as models for the students on how to approach something. Yeah. I'm listening to my friend in political science, but I know nothing about political science to speak of. So it pushed me in that place of uncertainty, like a student. And I think that might have been one of the greatest virtues of these classes for the students. Yeah. And then I started taking students to Italy in the summer for 3 weeks, 2 weeks little over 2 weeks. And we would go through 8 cities
Right.
because we had so little money when we were there that we learned Italy from top to bottom and were very comfortable. And Sandy went with me, and sometimes our younger son, Steve, did. But our Italian came back as we got out in the street, and we made no money, but we spent none. The school picked up the tab, and it was just marvelous. And so I was given full professor tenure, and I felt trapped like a rat. I said, this is so comfortable. I'm hating it. And I wasn't being challenged by the students. God bless them. They were doing the best they could. And then another pivot person, Robert Romanishin, who graduated from Duquesne and taught at the University of Dallas for many years, was invited out to Pacifica, and they hired him as a full-time core faculty. I'm just going to take a sip here.
Yeah.
So Robert was there for a couple of years, and I put his name in for a special semester-long chair that paid well, and whoever would be in that chair would bring their expertise. So Robert brought phenomenology, and that was a huge infusion into the university that I was in. Nobody had heard of it to speak of. I mean, I would talk a little bit here and there, and he was marvelous, and they loved him. Then he got me a teaching gig for the MA counseling meets 3 days a week, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. The middle day is either religion, myth, or literature. And he said, why don't you come in? I've got a spot for you and teach literature. So I did. I taught the Odyssey over 3 Saturdays, 3 months for the course. Then the next year I'm in Ohio at a family reunion, and I get a call from the provost. I'm telling you, these calls on the phone, I mean, they're spooky and they're life-changing. And Charles, the provost, said, how warm is it in Texas now? And I said, Sandy said it's 102. She was still in San Antonio. And he said, well, it's 73 out here. What would it take to get you out here full time? And I said, an invitation might just do it. And so when I went home, we negotiated the salary out. I finished teaching in the fall of 95. Christmas weekend of 95, we moved, and the next week our furniture and motorcycle that was in the van came, and that's where I settled in January of 96.
And what was it like to make that change? What was it, a huge change?
It was a huge change.
This is at the beginnings of Pacifica Graduate Institute, is it?
Yeah, it wasn't that old.
Yeah.
It was not, what do I want to say? Not certified. It wasn't accredited.
Yeah.
There was no tenure. I said, this is the kind of place for me. There's all this uncertainty. They were putting their ducks in a row to get accredited by the Western Association of Schools and Colleges.
Yeah.
I didn't care. And that it didn't have tenure. I think tenure is one of those things that has been abused beyond measure, but that's another conversation.
Yeah.
And they gave me the freedom pretty much to teach what I felt I was strong in. And so I led off with Homer's Odyssey. And it was it was either the first or second year of the Myth program. So it was still fresh, still ready to be built. And Christine Downing was part of that founding. So was David Miller, and I, and a few others. So we crafted this PhD in mythological studies which might still be the only one in the nation. It's not a folklore, it's not archaeology, and with a humanistic base and a depth psychological foundation.
Yeah, which is what makes it.
Please.
Well, that's what makes it different, isn't it? It's
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And it invited an interdisciplinary way of looking at everything. And I felt this is the best job I will ever have. So when we made a decision to move back in 2007, because our sons and our granddaughters, I said to Sandy, if it doesn't cost me my job at Pacifica, I'll move back. But this is a one-time deal. So, John, so we moved back in August of 2007, and I started flying out the next month to teach. And then I flew out for 10 years, the first 7 months of the year, for 2 weeks a month. And I think, and I added it all up, John, I was out there staying in a suite that they allowed me to stay in during that time for just under 4 years.
Right.
So it was a shuttle back and forth, and I didn't mind it a bit. So it was, so that brings us up to where we are. And sorry if I'm
No, that's good. Dennis, I'm just aware that we, because we'd spoken about doing 2 parts
yes,
to this, and I'm thinking that might be maybe a good place to stop for part 1, and then to just take up from that point of the Odyssey for part 2.
That's fine.
But I wanted to ask you a couple of things, though. Is the Odyssey your, what's your myth? I mean, I know that's a direct question, and I don't know whether the Odyssey is your favorite or you have another, or are they equal favorites, or can I ask that question?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the reasons I gravitated to Dante's Divine Comedy so strongly and offered it as a course in the Myth program, the entire course, except for a couple of hours where we would look at La Vita Nuova, the entire course, first meeting, Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. I like descents. I like to descend. I like to go down. But I also thoroughly enjoy horizontal journeys to across thresholds, coming up on crossroads. These are so appealing to me psychologically. And I bang into these all the time in my writing. So they're rich analogies, but I think I'm the journeyer. I like to be on journeys, and I like being on journeys alone.
Is that a Hermes? Can we call that a Hermes kind of slant?
Why not? Yeah, I think it is. And it's certainly Odyssean. I remember Jim Hillman either writing this or saying it at a talk. He said, I have no problem with the Gideon Bible in motels and hotel rooms, maybe across the world. I don't know how its spread is. But he said, why can't we have Homer's Odyssey in that same floor? I thought brilliant, because he said, look, the people in the room are either heading away from home or they're heading home. They're in transit, and they're taking this little, Lotus Eaters break, or the Circe break here on the stations of Odysseus.
And he Circe says, break.
But I'm seeing what I could get away with here. But I thought, brilliant. I mean, it felt so fitting. The Gideon Bible and Homer's Odyssey sitting in the drawer, talking to each other when the drawer is closed.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
A beautiful idea.
Well, Dennis, let's leave it there for now and come back to do our part two.
Okay.
And also considering we want to talk about next time is the way of myth, perhaps, and the whole
Yes.
idea, what you've written about. I mean, there's so many things I want to ask you. Is firstly, how do you, get to write all of those books, and that process for you a little, and then also this thing of finding one's own myth, how you've approached that, and how, I know
Yes.
you've taken lots of courses, seminars, written a book on that. And so maybe, it'll be great to go into all that part two.
No, great. I'm just jotting down a couple of notes here, John, so I don't forget. These are great topics. And
Yeah.
I have I think, a kind of fascinating story of how writing mythic writing,
Yeah.
plotting your personal story
Yeah.
came to be.
Right.
Yeah. And I
That'll be,
think that was also in the crafting of it, helping me to find my own myth, which I find pieces and shards of every time I'm writing.
right.
Yeah. Which is, I think, part of the impetus to keep writing, because things unfold
Yeah.
in ways that I couldn't have planned if my life was on the line. So these
Yeah.
are great topics.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much for sharing today, and I'll very much look forward to speaking to you next time.
Thank you, John. You're a wonderful host.
Thank you.
Wonderful host.